Okay, what if we could actually redesign the human being? I mean, really think about it. What if we could just eliminate aging, crank up our intelligence, and maybe even conquer death itself? Now, I know, it sounds like pure science fiction, but it's not. It's the core promise of a movement called transhumanism, and it forces us to ask some of the deepest, most profound questions about our future. So let's dive in and really explore what that future could look like. This quote from way back in 1998, wow, it just lays it all out there, doesn't it? This really captures the sheer ambition of the whole movement. We're not just talking about fixing a few problems here and there. This is about a complete re-engineering of what it means to be human, to break free from the biological rules we've always taken for granted. All right, to really get our heads around this huge topic, here's how we're going to break it down. First, we'll get a clear handle on what transhumanism actually is. Then, we'll look at the incredible, almost utopian dream it promises. After that, though, we have to get into the serious dangers and critiques. That leads to the big one. Could we lose our very humanity? And finally, we'll talk about, well, where do we go from here? Let's start with the basics. What are we really talking about when we use this word transhumanism? Let's nail down a clear definition. Okay, so at its heart, transhumanism is this belief that we shouldn't just have to accept our biological blueprint as the final word. The idea is that we should actively use technology, talking genetic engineering, robotics, AI, the whole shebang, to go beyond our fingerprints. It's a philosophy that's really born from this deep, deep desire to escape suffering, weakness, and, ultimately, death itself. And that desire leads to some really incredible promises. So let's take a look at the utopian vision that transhumanism is offering us. The historian Yuval Noah Harari actually lays out a possible roadmap for this. He sees it in 3 stages. First, you've got biological engineering, literally going in and editing our own DNA. Stage 2 is where it gets weirder, cyborg engineering. This is where we start merging our organic bodies with non-organic parts. Think advanced bionic limbs or tiny nanobots swimming through our blood. And the final, purely hypothetical stage, creating completely non-organic beings. A future where maybe consciousness could be uploaded, leaving our fragile bodies behind for good. Now, this whole idea takes an even more radical turn with one branch of the movement. Thinkers like David Pierce, who are sometimes called abolitionists, they see this as a moral duty. They argue that we should use genetics to completely wipe out all suffering and replace it with, well, what they call gradients of bliss. Essentially, to hardwire happiness directly into our biology. A world without suffering sounds amazing, right? Who wouldn't want that? But this is exactly where the debate gets incredibly complicated. And that brings us to the powerful critiques and the very real dangers of this vision. So, one of the most crucial points here is the super blurry line between therapy and enhancement. Look, using gene therapy to cure a terrible disease, that's one thing. But using that same technology to make a healthy person smarter or stronger, that's something else entirely. Pretty much everyone is on board with therapy, but enhancement, that opens up a total Pandora's box of ethical questions. And that leads to a huge fundamental challenge to that whole abolitionist dream. What if suffering isn't just a bug in our system? What if it's actually a feature? This is the absolute core of the counterargument. From a purely biological standpoint, physical pain is a vital survival signal, right? It tells you, hey, stop touching that hot stove. Psychologically, some theories, like rank theory, suggest that emotions like sadness actually evolved to help us navigate our complex social world. And then there's the big philosophical question. Would happiness even mean anything if we never felt sadness? From this point of view, suffering is actually what forces us to grow and gain wisdom. Then you've got the question of who gets to decide humanity's future. I mean, look at the survey data. It's pretty revealing, showing that the early proponents are overwhelmingly male and white. And this highlights a major critique. become more than human, could we accidentally lose what makes us human in the first place? To understand some of the deepest anxieties here, you have to look at some of the uncomfortable history. The term transhumanism itself, it was coined by a biologist named Julian Huxley, who also happened to be a prominent eugenicist. And it's this connection that makes critics point to some pretty disturbing parallels between the old eugenicist goal of improving the human race and the transhumanist goal of radical enhancement. Political scientist Francis Fukuyama just nails the core anxiety perfectly with this quote. Human nature isn't a bunch of separate parts. It's an incredibly complex, interconnected system. If you change one thing, like our emotions or our intelligence, you could have totally unpredictable and maybe devastating consequences for the whole package. It's really the ultimate question, isn't it? If we start replacing our memories with computer chips, our limbs with machines, and our emotions with programmed bliss, where is the line? At what point do we stop being us? And who even gets to draw that line? So, with such a huge debate raging, with these massive promises on one side and these terrifying risks on the other, how do we actually move forward? That brings us to the really crucial question of what the path ahead looks like. Now, it's really important to know that this debate isn't just external. It's happening inside the movement itself. Nick Bostrom, who's a leading transhumanist philosopher, argues for a much more balanced approach. He basically says you can hold on to that optimistic vision while also being relentlessly critical about the current risks and the huge potential for misuse. It doesn't have to be all or nothing. So this suggests a kind of framework for moving forward, some ethical guardrails we could put in place. First, any enhancement has to be totally voluntary, based on informed consent. We have to fight for equitable access to avoid creating that new kind of biological inequality. Where it's possible, these changes should be reversible. But most importantly, this whole thing requires a constant open public conversation about the ethics of what we're building. So in the end, we're left with this massive question. Technology is coming, one way or another, but it's forcing us to decide what we truly value about being human. Are our flaws, our struggles, and even our suffering, are they an essential part of the package? Or are they just limitations that we're meant to overcome on the path to